your ancestors lived through historic times, in fact, some of the most historic times in the American Southwest and frankly in our nation. This, of course, refers to when the first Europeans came through this area and encountered the O'odham, your ancestors. This was the Coronado expedition of 1539 to 1542. Now, what was the reaction of your ancestors? Well, many people suggest that the O'odham were peaceful and docile, and that they accepted and welcomed the newcomers. And we've been told that the ancestral O'odham resisted, but they did so ineffectively. Your ancestors were diplomats, but they were also the best regional warriors. And they did fight, they did resist, and they did so effectively. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about some of those details. Now, when Coronado came through this area, they were trying to get to Zuni or Cibola initially. The first site I found is the one down by Nogales labeled Suya, and now we have a whole series of sites that go all the way up to the Gila River, but the ones I want to talk about tonight are those in the purple area. That was the ancestral Sobaipuri O'odham territory. So basically the Santa Cruz River and the San Pedro River area, essentially near Benson. And this is the geographic context of what I'm going to be talking about, the sites I'm going to be focusing on. And this is where the Coronado expedition encountered your ancestors. The very first contact was with Fray Marcos de Niza in April and May of 1539, and he had with him Esteban, the Black Moor. Esteban was actually a few days ahead of him, like about a week, so he was actually the first non-native to enter this area as far as we know. And he actually got to Cibola, all the way to Cibola. Now Esteban, in advance, he was trying to notify people that they were on the way, find the route, and so on. And he had 60 of his own attendants, as well as greyhounds. But on the San Pedro, there were 300 Sobaipuri O'odham men that went with him. They went north to Zuni or Cibola with Esteban. And there were also some women that went along and some porters that went along. Now, when Esteban got to Hawiku at Zuni, he was killed. He reached there and he was turned away. The leader said, "No, I'm not going to see you." And despite this warning, Esteban insisted. Then he was taken prisoner in a building outside the pueblo, and the next day, trying to escape, he was killed. This is the story that we hear. Now, Fray Marcos de Niza, the friar, reported that all 300 people that went with him had died. That means all of the Sobaipuri had died. Everyone had been killed except for the few stragglers that left, that came running down and notified Fray Marcos of what happened. But a different and, in fact, more logical story is told by Coronado and also by Castaneda, who was another chronicler for the expedition. Coronado said they decided to kill Esteban, but they didn't do it in the way that was reported. I say this because they did not kill any of those who'd gone with them. The Indians told me they had killed him here at Hawiku because the Sobaipuri from Chichilticalli or the San Pedro told him he was a wicked man and not like the Christians because the Christians did not kill anyone's women, but he did kill them, the women, and also because he was touching their women, who the Indians loved more than themselves. Therefore, they decided to kill him. Now, the important part of this is that Esteban never got into Hawiku. So he was killed, but he was outside the pueblo. So it's not Zuni women that were violated and killed. In fact, what likely happened is since he didn't have access to Zuni women, and Sobaipuri O'odham women had gone north with Esteban, and the 300 men and women would not have gone north with him had he already killed and raped women at Chichilticalli or within O'odham territory. It's likely that the Sobaipuri women were the ones that were touched and killed. And it's likely that this happened on the way north. Otherwise, like I said, they would not have gone with him. So this represents the first missing and murdered indigenous women in this region of non-native on native violence. And it's important to know where this comes from and how deep it is. Now, the Sobaipuri intentionally misled Mnisa as to who was killed and who did the killing. Why would the O'odham mislead Fray Marcos? Well, they were avoiding retaliation for one, and they were conveying an acceptable scenario. And this was a form of resistance. When we put this into context, we can understand this. Fray Marcos was told by some of those stragglers who came running back that they have agreed to kill you. Because of you and Esteban, their relatives have died. Now, most scholars and Fray Marcos was of the assumption that all 300 had been killed, rather than just some women or girls. If they killed me, I told them, those who might kill me would suffer for it, because Christians would come in search of me and would kill them, all against my will. So importantly, at this early stage, the friar is using the full force of empire to save himself and to control the outcome. So the next stages of the expedition was received as Christians, that is, killers. The cross had become a symbol of oppression and violence, just as it had further south for Cortez and the Aztecs. Already egregious crimes had been committed against the Sobaipuri, and threats of more were going to be forthcoming if they sought justice. Very early, during the first 30 days of the expedition in this area, in the spring of 1539, the stage had been set. Now, 6 or 7 months later, Melchor Diaz came through with 17 horsemen and another captain, and they probably got here in December of 1539 and spent the first Christmas in the American Southwest. They stayed in the Benson area, basically where that big red blob is, amongst Sobaipuri settlements. They stayed at Chichilticalli on the San Pedro at a place called Nehpa, and Tony is going to tell you what we think that means in O'odham.
The way the Spaniards, the way they spelled it was Nexpa, and we were trying to figure out what that meant. It is an O'odham word, but what it is you say it Nuikpa, which is the black-headed buzzard, which is our clan.
Thank you. That was the Hispanicized way of saying what the O'odham had told them about what their area was known as and who they were known as. So it's really kind of a unique insight into who those people were and how you guys are related to them. Now, this is what the site, the archaeological site, looks like, where the Spaniards stayed. It's consistent with a 2-month-long winter encampment. We have fire pits and trash areas. We have metalworking areas, tent clearings, and 400 to 500 metal artifacts that relate to the Coronado expedition. We also have a whole range of artifacts that are characteristic of the Coronado expedition, so we know for sure that the expedition was there. And we have the ruined roofless house that characterizes this area. Now, importantly, the number of metal points, projectile points, their condition, their distribution, and so on, tell us that an unknown battle occurred here. And that's incredibly important because, first of all, it's not mentioned in the documentary record because, as one of the early historians noted, they were trying to keep the goings-on with this expedition secret from others, especially, for example, Cortez, who had conquered the Aztecs, because Cortez thought he should have run this expedition. After this was over, Cortez wrote to the king and said 12 horsemen had died who went with Diaz. And I think that's a reference to them dying during this battle. Now, what's important about this, and this may be the most important thing, this is the first known European Native American battle in the American Southwest. It's earlier than anything else that we know. And it's your ancestors. Now, the schematic on the left shows Coronado Expedition archaeological sites, encampments, and the red is one of the main villages that was there at the time, the Sobaipuri O'odham villages. When Diaz came, he got an entirely different reception than Fray Marcos de Niza had gotten. We see this in the spacing of archaeological sites, encampments. We see this in artifacts, and we see this in the documentary accounts. Your ancestors gave them a very cold reception, and they were not encouraging them to stay. We have a quote from Diaz that says, "Those from Cibola or Zuni told those of this Sobaipuri Pueblo and its vicinity that if some Christians came, that they did not have to hold them in any regard and that they should kill them because they were mortal, and that they knew it because they had the bones of the one who had gone there, Esteban, and that if the Sobaipuri did not dare, then to send them a message because they could come and do it right. They would come and do it right. I believe that this happened like this and that these conversations have been discussed with the Sobaipuri based on the lukewarmness with which they received us and the mean face that the Sobaipuri have shown us." So they were basically telling them, you're not welcome here. Now, this account also tells us that there was a Sobaipuri village and others in the vicinity consistent with what Fray Marcos had said. This site is that village. I found it years ago, but reconfirmed it now. We know this is the village in part because it has a chronometric date that's consistent with the Coronado expedition. All of these houses represent not only the Coronado period, but much earlier occupations by the Sobaipuri. And also we have this house outline of rocks here, and that's where the date came from. But what we have here is evidence of the undocumented battle that includes battle-related spoils, artifacts, including a forked muzzle support that would not have been used later in time, and a Biscayan axe, and some points and so on. Now, we know that the O'odham controlled their territory, and we see this in the spacing of Coronado expedition encampments relative to this specific village. They're appropriately distanced for people who are not friendly to one another. They're essentially 2 arquebus shots away, or 2 musket shots away, which is about 500 meters. Now we see this in other accounts from the Pueblo area where enemy Apache would come visit the Pueblos, and they would stay 400 to 500 meters away from the Pueblo for safety of the host Pueblo and themselves. And we also see it in later Spanish accounts where the military would go and visit new people, and they would stay at least 1 arquebus shot, if not 2, away from the settlement. That ensured safety among enemies. Now, this is very different than what the treatment that Fray Marcos had on his northbound trip. He stayed in and near Sobaipuri O'odham villages and those of other indigenous people on his way north. He stayed in houses that they built for him, and he also stayed on the edge of these pueblos. So what we're seeing is a rapidly changing reaction amongst the native people, not just in the O'odham territory, but elsewhere, but especially here, to this encounter. So within 6 or 7 months, the O'odham are already setting boundaries and limiting the threat to their people, to their communities. The distance the expedition went was often determined by how many villagers they met. And we can see on the right-hand side the kind of settlement pattern that Fray Marcos described. He was talking about clusters of villages and hamlets that formed a neighborhood, and then a space, and then another one. And we can see this in the archaeological record. But because there were so many villages in this area, the expedition had to stop. They had to get permission to pass. They had to give and receive gifts. They had to participate in receptions and celebrations. and they had to answer questions as they went through these highly populated areas. So when Coronado came through in late June of 1540, he encountered a very different social landscape. Now, the Sobaipuri were diplomats, and they used discretion. So instead of confronting the Spaniards, the Sobaipuri gave a gift of little value. As Jaramillo said, some Indians that we now know are the Sobaipuri came out to see the general with a gift of little value, some roasted maguey stalks and pitahaya. And I delved deeply into this, and there's no other native group in this area that was occupying this stretch of the river at this time, so it has to be the O'odham. And what we're seeing here is quiet, collective defiance, withholding resources, an important form of resistance. Did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, one of the things that, as O'odham, we don't come out and say, no, you can't have any food, or no, we can't give you anything. But what the O'odham did was they gave them poor quality of food or gifts, but without really saying, we're not giving you anything. So, and that's just the way we O'odham are. We don't come out and tell, people, no, you can't have it, or no, we can't give it to you. But what we do in defiance is give something way less than what we will give people that are more friendly to us.
Thank you. Now, the reason Coronado and Jaramillo had an expectation of better gifts and why they commented so negatively is because Fray Marcos got better gifts. When he first came, everybody was friendly because he was friendly. And he said, they brought me much game deer, rabbits, quail, corn, pinole, all in great abundance. They offered me many turquoises, hides, very lovely gourd bowls, and other things. And so the expedition had an expectation for better gifts, but they were met with minimal compliance. Again, resistance. The gift of little value from the Sobaipuri to Coronado had dire consequences for the expedition. This is why Coronado could only stay 2 days on the San Pedro at Chichilticalli. He said the horses were desperate, they needed to rest, and he could only rest them for 2 days. They needed pasture, they needed to rest because they were carrying heavy loads. And they were hungry, the people were hungry, and that's why they had to move on, because the Sobaipuri didn't give them enough food, and they didn't give them quality food. And what they needed also was corn for the horses, because that would have given them enough energy. This made them desperate. This had consequences for the expedition from that point forward. They had 240 miles between Benson, essentially, and Zuni, through some of the roughest country. Many horses died, and many expeditionaries died, including from eating poisonous food because they were so hungry. And then when they got to Zuni, they attacked right away because they were desperate for food. They basically needed to get in there and get the corn. What's important about this too, though, is I'm not sure that the Sobaipuri ever knew the impact of this small act of defiance. And I think that's really important. Now we have a rapidly changing social landscape, and this is a schematic of about 1.5 mile stretch of the San Pedro River where these villages were. And when Fray Marcos came in, first guy through with Esteban, in 1539, he says, I entered a valley very heavily settled with splendid people. He said, the neighborhoods of houses are 1/2 league and 1/4 league apart. And then these started dropping out as the expedition came through. And then when Coronado came, he told the viceroy, the expeditionaries saw that everything the friar said was found to be the opposite. There was none of the things that Fray Marcos told about. Some of the villages had likely been abandoned by 1540 when Coronado came through. Again, a rapidly changing landscape of encounter. Fray Marcos didn't lie like many historians have said. The Sobaipuri changed their behavior. They changed where they had settled. This is reinforced by the comment from Fray Marcos after he went most of the way to Zuni and was told everybody got killed. He came back. They almost killed him there. And when he got back to the San Pedro at the Chilticali area, he said, we were not received as well as first. So they got even colder reception at this point. One village remained as more of the expedition went through. And that village is not huge. The O'odham from surrounding villages and hamlets didn't congregate there for defense against the Spaniards. It appears they didn't stay in the same area. And so it looks like there's a population reduction in the area immediately following these first couple of stages of the expedition. And I think that they were fleeing as a form of resistance. Fleeing is a well-recognized form of resistance. It's practiced since time immemorial, and we see it throughout historical documents for the Southwest. But also, those of you who went to Santa Cruz de Gibanapatea with me years ago, that place where the 1698 battle occurred, the Sobaipuri O'odham won against 500 Apache and their allies when they attacked on Easter morning. But the Sobaipuri left the San Pedro for 5 years before coming back, because discretion is the better part of valor. The population was probably fleeing, but also there was probably a population reduction owing to communicable diseases. There were major outbreaks in central Mexico and elsewhere in 1538 and throughout that period, as codices and other sources tell us. And so it's highly possible that these diseases were transmitted into the area, and these would account for the population reduction that seems apparent within Sobaipuri territory at this time. So, Suya. That's the first site we found. It's where a 1541 rebellion by the O'odham occurred, by the Sobaipuri O'odham, your ancestors. This is the first European settlement in the American Southwest, and it's a town site. It's important for that reason, too. And you can see some videos and articles on this if you want. Now, the Sobaipuri rose up in battle in 1541. This is the first successful Native American uprising in the Southwest and in the continental US. And yes, that is Tony and others in your community. Now, the reason it's the most successful battle by Native Americans against Europeans in this time period is because no Europeans returned here for 150 years. They went other places, but they didn't go through here. So until now, the 1680 Pueblo Revolt has been considered the most successful rebellion by Native Americans. And they consider it, I gave Tony and David a book, that they claim it's the first American Revolution. Well, now you guys get to claim that. You have the first American Revolution. So why did the attack occur at this town site? Well, the documents do tell us Captain Alcarez, who oversaw the settlement, had been the cause of the uprising because of the brutality and outrages he perpetrated against the natives, taking their wives and girls by force and against their will in order to have sex with them. He took too much tribute. He took 2 shares of the resources they gathered. He required too many personal services, and he mutilated people. Even after that, the Sobaipuri were not rash. They started out by mocking and warning the captain. The Sobaipuri, we're told, made an effigy in the name of the captain and placed it on a piece of land. Everyone shot many arrows at it, saying, "Captain, Captain," and that after a very long time, they gave it a great shout, repeating again, "Captain, Captain," and they dragged it to a place where they sat down to drink prickly pear wine, since there were many in these parts. And although news and warning were received, the captain was careless, so he didn't do a thing to prevent it. One night, unexpectedly, the Spaniards saw fires that were not usual or customary, which caused them to double the watches, and we had lookout stations all around the site. But since they sensed nothing during the whole night, at dawn they let their guard down, and the enemy Sobaipuri entered the town so quietly that they were not seen until they were killing and robbing. Some people were somehow able to reach the plain, and upon their leaving, the Sobaipuri mortally wounded the captain. And as some Spaniards regrouped on some horses, they turned on the enemy Sobaipuri and helped some people, although it was few, and the enemy Sobaipuri left with booty without receiving injury. None of them were killed, leaving 3 Spaniards dead and many servants and more than 20 horses. And one of my favorite parts of the story is the 2 women or girls that he had in his cabin with him, helped him put on his wipil for the battle and stabbed him with poison arrows as they did. So that's kind of like the Yellow Rose of Texas, if you're familiar with that story. The 2 red roses of Suya is how I refer to this. We're told in a later account, one night the whole land came upon them. This implies that Sobaipuri villages came together from throughout the region. There were likely hundreds of warriors because they wanted to ensure that they were going to win. The events of 1539 on the San Pedro convey why so many probably came to assist. It was a pitched battle. The yellow arrows show where the O'odham entered the settlement, and the red are where crossbow bolt heads and other metal points were found. And this here shows stone Sobaipuri arrowheads at that same battle arroyo. Those who were out there, we called this the battle or the attack arroyo. You saw that. And then also where the second cannon was found, which was used in the battle, but it blew up on the person who was using it, and so it was ineffective. These are some of the Spanish metal artifacts that we've found related to the battle. And here are the range of projectile points we found, including formal crossbow bolt heads and lance heads and atlatl heads and so on. And you can read about this in some of the articles. We have possible sling stones and dozens of Sobaipuri arrowheads. And then we have the 2 cannons, the wall guns, that we found here at the site. This is the battle damage there. These represent the earliest known firearms on the continental landmass. It's the first known firearms from the Coronado expedition and from the exploration era in the US and on the continent. We know now that Suya, the town site, had its own set of cannon. And we know this because a 3rd one has been found, and it was damaged, probably by O'odham. And I think that it was found it was probably guarding a mining encampment away from the settlement. We can't know for sure, but the reason I think this is because there's a quote, prior to this 1541 uprising, sources of gold had been discovered, but because they were in the war zone and there was no possibility of working them, they were no longer being worked. And I think the O'odham that they were forcing to work at this mine probably overran the encampment and then ritually destroyed and deposited this cannon. So that is a very bold form of resistance as well. So at the Battle of Suya, or San Jeronimo III in 1541, no Sobaipuri were killed. 100 townspeople died. 4 Spaniards were among them, plus a bunch of other people. But not all the Europeans were killed, and that's a different story. In some, the O'odham showed discretion, and they had measured responses to this intrusion. They let Fray Marcos go, especially after he told them that hell would come after them if hell would come to earth if they tried to kill him. But also, the Sobaipuri gave a lukewarm reception to Diaz. Rather than say, get out of our territory, they basically gave him the cold shoulder and tried to get the point across that way. They established a safety zone for Spanish encampments so that everyone could remain safe and not by mistake get into trouble. They gave poor food rather than no food. They fled, they delayed, and they minimally complied. But also they had extreme responses. They killed Esteban. They contemplated killing Fray Marcos. They attacked Diaz and his 18 soldiers early in 1540 at Chichilticalli, which again is the first native European battle in the American Southwest. They probably attacked the mining camp, as I said, which is inferred from that third canon and from the documents. And also they killed almost everyone at Suya. This is the first successful Native American uprising in the Southwest and in the continental US. Like I said, because no one came back. So the initial encounter with Fray Marcos appeared to be benign and pleasant. He probably sat with your ancestors and shared stories and so on, and everybody was probably curious. But the first transgression was within the first 30 days. And this began with the rape and killing of Sobaipuri O'odham women. And this began the legacy of a historically based trauma, harm to women and girls that continues, as you know, to this day. This and Marcos's threat set off a cascade of responses within local communities. And community members responded with a variety of resistance measures. Now, this caused internal strife and management problems for the expedition, and also death from hunger and battle among the expeditionaries. But also it resulted in native deaths from hunger, battle, disease, and disruption. But it's clear, I think, from this evidence that I've presented here, that the O'odham resisted. They did so effectively with meaningful consequences. It was 150 years, 5 or 6 generations before any Europeans came back. That's significant.